I'm Gesine Reinert. I'm also at Oxford, but in a different department than Jared. I'm in the Department of Statistics, and I'm going to talk to you about statistical inference for networks. Here's a short outline, talk about summaries, models, and then a little bit of statistics, further topics, and then something to pay attention to. So a little bit of a reading list. I understand the slides will be made available or are available to you. So if you wanted to do any further reading, you can do that. There is no book which does exactly what we are going to do in this lecture, but you can piece things together more or less. What are networks? Networks are just graphs. Often we think of a network as being a connected graph, but that doesn't have to be the case. So we just use network and graph interchangeably. Here's some examples. This is a yeast protein interaction network from the year 2001 published. The nodes are colored according to lethality. So when you remove them, will yeast still survive? And what you see is that the network is heterogeneous. So you see some hubs, so some network with very large degrees. You also see that it is sparse in the sense that it's tree-like mostly. And you also see that you've got this hairball in the middle where you don't see anything. And that's the main challenge in the analysis of networks. Here's another example where you can actually see quite a lot, but still you can't quite figure out what might be going on. This is a pathway for Parkinson's disease. These are edges linking intercellular components, so they could be proteins, there could be other agents. There are different types of connections. Many of these connections are only conjectured to exist. So this is the network which is part data, part conjecture. Here's a very classical network, the marriage network between Florentine families. This type of network was analyzed in the area of social network analysis for a very long time. So you might think it's two networks, but it's the same network, just represented in two different ways. So these were the Florentine families in the 1400s, and the top 20 Florentine families only, according to taxation records. They were painstakingly assembled by Crackart, who went through all the records in Florence, which were available for that time period. So you see there is a family, the Medici, and they have quite a few marriage connections with other families. There's also another family, Strozzi, which is also relatively prominent, but the Medici and the Strozzi don't wed amongst each other, which is a reflection of the fact that there were fierce competitors or arch enemies at the time. You also see in this representation that the Pucci family doesn't seem to marry at all. That's of course not the case, but they just didn't have any marriage ties between the top 20 families in Florence, so they would have married with another family. A network which, for those of you who are new to London, might become more familiar to you is the London congestion network. This is roads and tube combined, and here the question of the study was at which speed should the tube network run in order to minimize congestion. And there's the study that turned out that the optimum was something like 8.3 times the speed of the traffic. And when you do that, see here's a lot of congestion in the whole network, and then the congestion moves to the end of the tube lines. So the tube lines are red because they transport lots of passengers, but otherwise the center of London is fairly congestion free, with the congestion moving to the end of the tube stations. So these are some examples. Network occur in many different areas. Biological examples, spread of epidemics, neural networks, social networks, management board. So you probably come across networks yourselves. And typically unless the network is very small, it just looks like a hairball. So it's very difficult to analyze. Even when it's small, it's not so easy to analyze. Research questions include, how do these networks work? How can we manipulate, say, a biological network in order to prevent tumor growth? How do networks evolve? How similar are networks? How similar are Facebook networks? How can you compare them? Is there a change in networks? Can you spot a cyber attack through a change in your internet network? How are networks interlinked? You are probably a member of more than one social network. How do these link together? The London transport network is linked in with other transport networks. How do we study these interlinks? From a more principled viewpoint, what are the building principles of these networks? How do we achieve resilience? And how do we achieve flexibility? We want a network to be efficient. We don't want it to be too expensive. We don't want to have too many tube lines. But at the same time, we want the tube network to do the trick. So in order to answer these questions, because we have the hairballs, we first resort to network summaries, which may or may not be relevant. So I'm going to present to you the classical network summaries. Depending on the problem that you are looking at, you might want to use other network summaries. The first summary is, if G is the network, V is the vertex set, and so the number of nodes, and E is the set of edges. Today we just assume that all the edges have the same weight, and we set the weight as 1. So in the tube network you would have loading on the edges, but we've only got 50 minutes, so we can't do loaded networks. We assume that the edges are not directed, and there are no self-loops, there are no multiple edges, so it's called a simple network. So the graph density is of the first characteristic, so that's the ratio between the number of edges we see and the potential number of edges. And there's a big difference in behavior between dense graphs and sparse graphs. Sparse graphs are graphs which look locally tree-like. Dense graphs are graphs where everyone is connected to a large fraction of other nodes. When the U and V are two nodes and there's an edge from U to V, we say that they are neighbors. And we can describe a network by its adjacency matrix. And in the simple case, the adjacency matrix has entries 0 or 1, and it's 1 if and only if there's an edge between U and V. So it's a quadratic symmetric matrix with zeros on the diagonal in this case. The degree of a node is the number of its neighbors. The degree distribution of a graph on n nodes is the vector of fraction of vertices with this given degree. So we see how many vertices are there of degree 10, of degree 12, and so on. For directed graphs, you can also look at the in degree and the out degree. And those who looked at the book by Newman, which was the recommended reading, read a little bit about how in degree and out degree can differ. So there's also information in that, but we are not going into detail here. The local clustering coefficient is intuitively the number of the proportion of friends which are friends themselves. So I know Jared and I know Sophia. It's likely that Jared and Sophia also know each other. More likely than without them knowing me, actually. Maybe in this case not, because I think they've known each other for longer than I've known them. Might be more the other way around. But so in adjacency matrix notation, you have the number of triangles that V is involved in divided by the number of, well, 2 stars that V is involved in. And 0 divided by 0 is 0. The average clustering coefficient is then just the average of these clustering coefficients. And it measures how locally dense a graph is, so how well people are connected to each other. Sometimes this local clustering coefficient is also called transitivity. It goes back to social network theories from Granovetter and so on. So there's a big history of these objects. The global clustering coefficient is much easier to calculate. It's 3 times the number of triangles divided by the number of connected triples. So not centered around an individual node, and indeed these two clustering coefficients are different. In the network literature, it took people about 2 years to spot that they are different. So people, when networks first started coming up, people had different definitions of what clustering coefficient meant, and then there was some reconciliation. So now we call the one the global and the other one the local clustering coefficient. So in the Florentine family example, the global clustering coefficient is 0.19, and roughly the average clustering coefficient is 0.14. So is this a meaningful distinction? Are these numbers large or small? We don't know yet, but we will come to that. So also in physics, people then look at the expected clustering coefficient, which is 3 times the expected number of triangles divided by the expected number of connected triples. Is it clear why we use the number 3? Because each triangle contains 3 connected triples. So in a complete graph, we would want to have clustering coefficient exactly equal to 1. In the literature, especially in applied analysis, often any of these 3 clustering coefficients is used and called clustering coefficients. So you might have to figure out yourself which one is meant in the particular paper that you are reading. So here I mean by clustering coefficient the global clustering coefficient. So just the 3 times the number of triangles divided by the number of 2 stars. When it comes to the transmission of information in the network, the shortest distance is quite important. So the distance between 2 nodes is the length of the shortest path joining them, if there is such a path. So if the network is not connected, then we won't not necessarily have such a path. The path doesn't have to be unique, but its length is. The average shortest path length in a connected graph is then just the average of all the shortest path lengths. And that tells you something about how fast a virus would spread across the network. It describes how globally connected a graph is. Other popular summaries, motifs, or a motif is for us is just a small subgraph on 2 nodes or 3 nodes or 4 nodes or 5 nodes. It has been conjectured by Yuri Alon in a famous book that small subgraphs are the building blocks of complex networks, in the sense that the functionality of networks is often achieved just through few nodes working together. That is certainly the case in biological networks, and it's not quite clear whether it's in which other networks it is the case, but it's an interesting object to look at. There are other measures. So there's the betweenness. The betweenness of a node is the number of shortest paths, the proportion of shortest paths that pass through this node. The betweenness of an edge is the proportion of shortest path passing through that edge. The connectivity of a connected graph is the smallest number of edges whose removal results in a disconnected graph. And there are also, following up with Jared's talk, there's also spectral decompositions of the adjacency matrix, which provide other summaries. And you could even think of trying to sparsify the adjacency matrix, so trying to look at lower dimensional summaries, trying to get the more relevant information out of the adjacency matrix, perhaps. Specific networks may require specific summaries. So these are the off-the-shelf summaries. If you look at a particular example, you might find that other summaries are more meaningful. So I've already showed you these numbers for the clustering coefficient in the Florentine marriage network. In itself, the number doesn't mean anything, right? You know the clustering coefficient is between 0 and 1, but 0.14, is that large or is it small? Who knows? So in order to assess whether it's large or small, you need some kind of model, background model. You need to know what would be expected. When is a network summary unusual? When is a motif frequent? So we think of some randomness in the network. Otherwise, it's very difficult to say what we would expect in a statistical view, from a statistical viewpoint. And the randomness can come from the construction of the network itself, such as networks in disease transmission. If you catch the flu, you don't know exactly whom caught it from. Right? someone else has a code here in the center in the Alan Turing Institute, you might catch it from that person, but you might also have caught it from someone on the tube. So you don't know for sure how the disease transmission came from. Could be also randomness just in errors in the data collection, or as is in the case in biological networks, quite hard to collect those errors. Also, there's randomness in the fact that our networks are snapshots in time, whereas the real networks undergo changes. The traffic network, the London traffic network, is not a static network. There's forever something going on. So to understand the underlying randomness in the networks, several mathematical models have been proposed. The simplest model is the Bernoulli random graph model. Bernoulli random graph says, it's by Erdős and Renyi, that edges appear independently or with the same probability. So if you've got n nodes, then the expected number of edges is, well, we've got n nodes, each node has n minus 1 neighbors. If p is the edge probability, we multiply by p, but we divide by 2 because we count each edge twice, because we include both endpoints. So you could also write it n choose 2p. This is just the binomial coefficient. The expected clustering coefficient we can also calculate similarly. So it's n choose 3 ways to choose 3 nodes. And for a triangle, they all have to be connected. That happens with probability p cubed. And for a 2-star, you only need 2 connections. So the expected clustering coefficient is p. So under this model, joint friends don't influence the odds of friendship under this model. If I know Jared, if I know Sophia, there's no influence on whether Sophia and Jared know each other or not. So that's not what we see in real networks. So it's a very nice model and relatively straightforward to analyze mathematically. But it's really often only used as a null model, as something that we want to reject. We want to say there's more structure in the data than this. So in real networks, we usually see a higher clustering coefficient than expected, so more local clustering, a shorter average shortest path length than expected, so information travels faster than we would expect, and more nodes with high degrees than expected. So we see some very popular nodes, which would be very unusual in Bernoulli random graphs. In Bernoulli random graphs, there will be some variability in the degree distribution of a node, but not very much. This phenomenon of short path and high clustering coefficient is also called the small world phenomenon. How many of you have heard of small worlds? Okay, so it's something that one says, so if you go to the airport and you have to queue behind someone and not someone you know, you start chatting, finds out you've got a joint acquaintance, then you might say, oh, it's a small world. So this small world phenomenon means that you have shorter path lengths than expected, and also usually higher local clustering than expected under a Bernoulli random graph. So this whole area of network science, as it's sometimes called now, really took up with a paper by Watts and Strogatz from 1998. They came up with this very simple model that you put your vertices or nodes on a ring or on a lattice more generally. You connect everybody to their k nearest neighbors, and then you delete edges at random and rewire them with a certain rewiring probability. Now that turned out not to be a very useful model because you can get disconnected graphs. So with a modification by Mark Newman, the same one who both wrote this big book, instead of rewiring, we just add shortcuts in this network. Now this network is not very likely to what you will see in practice, but it is a useful concept to find out how network statistics can behave. So especially depending on the rewiring probability, we can get very short path length, and because of this fixed lattice structure, we also got a high clustering coefficient usually. So we can achieve the small world phenomenon. So in particular, so you see from this fixed lattice, if you just had the fixed lattice without any shortcuts, then the average shortest distance between two nodes is n over 4, if n is the number of nodes, because you have to walk around the lattice. But as soon as you introduce just a few shortcuts, the average shortest distance is of order log n. So spreading information goes much, much faster. Travel goes much faster. So sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. But in any case, it's something that's useful to understand. But because in the Watt-Strogatz model, we wire uniformly and randomly, or we add edges uniformly and randomly, we don't produce node degree distributions which have hubs or very popular nodes. So Barabasi-Albert and Albert noticed around the same time that the graph of actor collaborations, so who collaborated with other actors in films, and also the World Wide Web had degree distributions which were of this type here. So the probability that a random vertex has degree k decays like k to the minus gamma. So that's a slow decay. That's called a heavy tail. So this is called a power law behavior, because we've got the power law exponent, and the whole type of network model was called scale-free network model, or scale-free random graphs. Scale-free because if you multiplied k by alpha, so put it on a different scale, then we would still have a decay in k to the minus gamma, and only the constant would change. Physicists like scale-free things. They appeal to general principles of how the world is made. So Barabasi and Albert came up with a model, or actually with a class of models, which said in order to generate scale-free graphs, we could think of starting with maybe just two nodes, and then at every time a new vertex arrives, a new node arrives, and it tries to attach preferably to a node who already has many friends, who already has a high degree. So that's called preferential attachment. So in this easiest, simplest model, node I is chosen proportional to its degree, time I. So initially, every node has the same probability of being chosen, but once a node has been chosen a few times, then the node is more likely to be chosen again. So it's a rich get richer phenomenon. And this construction does give power law, does give the rise of hub to hubs. Here in this particular construction, the power law is exponent 3, but there are variants which achieve other power laws. This construction itself, if you only add one edge at a time, doesn't give any triangles, though. So that's not very realistic for networks. But it's possible to modify this construction so that we add more than one edge at a time, so that we also see triangles, so that we get clustering coefficients. Actually, you can modify the construction so that you can get any clustering coefficient. It's also not a good thing, because that doesn't tell you exactly what's typical in this model. The stochastic block model actually was first proposed in the social science literature and is currently perhaps the model of choice. The stochastic block model says you've got nodes which are of different types, and there's an edge between any two nodes depending on their types. So if you're of type, oh, I like purple jumpers, then you're more likely than someone else is of type, oh, I like pink jumpers, or I like blue jumpers, then the probability of you connecting to them might depend on the colors of jumper which they like. Or you could think of other analogies. But otherwise, the edges are independent. So once you know which type a vertex is, you can describe this this model quite well. This model does not produce a power law distribution, but you could think of a type being that you like to have lots of friends, and therefore having a high probability of connecting to other people. So you can have nodes with high degree, but you don't get exactly this power law distribution out. So as null model, as I said, you might want to look at the Bernoulli random graph model as a null model, as something that might not actually be the true model, but something that you want to reject. But some people might criticize you for saying it's so ridiculous that you might want to reject it anyway. So another class of null models is based on the degrees. So given a real network, you want to know what's expected in that network, you think, okay, you look at the degrees of all the nodes in the network, and then you compare the network to all other networks that have the same degree distribution. So you fix the degree of the nodes, and you just add edges at random according to the degrees. And then you see how your network statistics behaves compared to all other networks with the same degree distribution. So you can do that either with the exact degrees, or you can use, say, two nodes are connected with a probability which is proportional to the product of their degrees. Then you have independent edges. In the configuration model where you just connect two nodes according to their degrees, you don't have independent edges. So mathematically, this Chung-Lu model or sticky model, or also called Newman-Gilman model, can be easier to analyze. So these are also good null models. And here's an example for when you might want to have a special model for a special situation. This is a duplication divergence model, which is used in genetics, actually. So you think of your network as being a genetic network, where your node at a time t, so a node is picked and it duplicates. And when it duplicates also all of its connections. But the child then decides which connections to keep, and the child node deletes edges independently with probability q, and also creates edges independently to other nodes with the probability r. Well, it's often scaled by t, the number of time steps, so that the probability decreases with the number of nodes, so that the expected number of neighbors stays the same. And then if you've got a singleton, you just force it to connect. Yeah, so this is just the slide saying specific models for specific networks. Depending on the research question, there might be other methods around, other models around, which you might want to apply. So now you've got your model. How do you fit a model? Well, the gold standard fitting in statistics is maximum likelihood. Yeah, maximum likelihood means you write down the likelihood of your model, and you choose your parameter p, which maximizes the likelihood. So if you have if you toss a coin 100 times, and it comes up head 45 out of 100 times, what would you estimate as probability to come up head? 45 out of 100. That's the same in Bernoulli random graphs. The maximum likelihood estimate is the one that's just the proportion of edges in the network. So you can calculate this analytically, but don't have to go through that here. Maximum likelihood estimators are desirable in statistics because it's known that they are asymptotically efficient. Under some regularity conditions, they are asymptotically normally distributed. We know the asymptotic variance. So maximum likelihood estimation works well in Bernoulli random graph. It works well in stochastic log models once we know the group assignments. But it works well in Watt-Strogatz once we know the number of nearest neighbors that we are connecting to. So for independent edges, it works well. But as soon as dependence is introduced, for example, if you don't know the types in the stochastic log model, maximum likelihood doesn't work anymore. It's just, well, let's not go into detail. So an alternative which works in more situations than maximum likelihood, or it's also is more feasible than maximum likelihood, is method of moments. So the kth moment of a probability distribution, or is mu k. Mu k is the expectation of x to the power k, where x is a random variable which has the distribution, and e is the expectation. So the first moment is the mean, the second moment is not the variance, but it's the variance plus the mean squared, and so on. And these moments you could estimate. So if you've got independent replicas of x, then you can estimate the moment just by the average of the sample moments. And this turns out to be a consistent estimator, and often your parameters depend on the moment in some way. So it could be the variance, or it could be 1 over the variance. But so once you've got something that you can express in terms of moments, you estimate your parameter in terms of the sample moments. And similarly, if we don't have quite the moments, but if you've got a monotone function of the random variable, then you can also estimate that using this method of moments. So in Bernoulli random graphs, the expected number of edges is n choose 2 times p, and so p hat is the number of edges divided by n choose 2, same as maximum likelihood in this example. They don't always have to coincide. And maximum likelihood is more efficient when it works in general, but it doesn't work less often. So in the duplication divergence model, it's very difficult to maximize the likelihood. It's a very complicated model. And so usually it's fitted using the method of moments. When you fit it by the method of moments, there's a problem in that the probability landscape for estimating, so we need to estimate the probability of deleting an edge and the probability of creating an edge. And the landscape is very flat. So when you try to find a maximum or a best fit in something that's very flat, you might go quite wrong. So it's a bit of an unsolved problem how to do proper inference in this setting, just because the landscape is so flat. One of my doctoral students is working on it, so I might be able to update you in half a year's time. Scale-free networks, that's when we want to fit the Pareto exponent. So the probability of the degree, remember, is c times k to the minus gamma. So we can take the logarithm, and we get the log probability of degree is equal to k, like log c minus gamma log k. Yeah? So this equation suggests that if you want to estimate gamma, you can just plot the probability that the log of probability degree equal to k, or the relative frequency of seeing the degree k, versus log k. Here, alpha k would be a general way of scaling. This is called a log-log plot. And if the model is correct, then we should see a straight line. And the slope would be the estimate of gamma. These relative frequency plots have quite a lot of noise in the tails. It's a bit more stable to estimate the probability that degree is at least as large as k. And this again, the log-log plot should follow a straight line. So here's an example for the yeast data started out with. Here's the degree distribution. So log p of k, and here's the exceedance probability bigger or equal to k. Does it look like a straight line? Not quite, right? So usually it turns so for a straight line, we often so in order to fit the straight line, we use least squares regression. So we fit a line a plus b log k, which minimizes y of k minus a minus b log k squared summed over all k, least squares line. And we estimate the quality using the coefficient of determination. So coefficient of determination is just the ratio of s squared xy divided by sxx syy. So sxy is the scaled correlation between the y's and the x's. Sxx is the individual variance of the x's, also scaled, and ssy is the individual variance of the y's. So this is actually the correlation coefficient squared. It's called the coefficient of determination. And it measures the strength of the linear relationship, just like the correlation coefficient. In linear regression, in ordinary linear regression, r squared larger than 0.9 would be deemed a good fit. But in log-log plots, it turns out that it's very easy to see something that looks like a straight line. So the rules of thumb is that the r squared should be at least 0.99, and the observed data or degrees should cover at least 3 orders of magnitude. Examples include the World Wide Web at some stage, about 15 years ago, when it had about 10 to the power 9 nodes. The criteria are not often matched. So in this example, the r squared was something like 0.8 something, which individually looks good. So if you had if these were your original data, especially those ones, you might think it's not a bad fit, but really it is a bad fit. You have to be very careful when you do log-log plots. So this is of the gold standard is maximum likelihood or the method of moments, but quite often neither of these work. For example, in a stochastic block model, it's as if you don't know the group assignments, the method of moments doesn't work very well. So instead, you can use Markov chain Monte Carlo. So it's something which you will talk about. All right, so you will learn about that much more in the next lecture. So Markov chain Monte Carlo, the Markov chain is a stochastic process where the state at time n only depends on the state at time n-1 plus some independent randomness. It's irreducible if any state can be reached from any other state in a finite number of moves. It's reversible if you can't tell whether you run it forwards or backwards in time. And the distribution is stationary. If you start in the stationary distribution, then after the next step you can't tell. So the distribution would be just the same as the distribution you started out with. It turns out if a Markov chain is irreducible and reversible, then it has a unique stationary distribution. And no matter in which state you start the chain, you will eventually converge to the stationary distribution. You will possibly correct me or make this more precise. So this is the top level description. So we can look at our distribution on networks, or the distribution of the adjacency matrix of the network as the distribution of a stationary Markov chain, where the moves consist in adding and deleting edges. Or in stochastic block models, we could also add types or reduce types. So finding suitable Markov chain models which converge fast is an area of active research. There are implementations available and approximations. Just to warn you, there is no guarantee that the Markov chain has reached the stationary distribution, because you know that if you wait for an infinitely long time, you will be there, but you don't have that much time. Life is finite. So you will always have to cut off, and there's always the odd chance that there's some part of the sample space which you just haven't explored yet. So if you can avoid it using MCMC, then you should, Markov chain Monte Carlo, you should avoid it. Also, it is possible that the stationary distribution is not unique, so that there are two different types of distributions. And that has been proved to be the case in some random graph models. So then also Markov chain Monte Carlo will fail, or you will be hard-pressed to interpret the results. Now, so these are sort of warnings. Now suppose that we have fitted a model or somewhere or other. How do we test the model, whether it actually fits? So one way of doing that is using probability theory. So we can study the asymptotic distributions of the summary statistics, which we're interested in, say node degree or clustering coefficient. Then we can see whether the observed data are plausible under the model. And often in statistics, we would like to reject the null model. We would be excited if there's something more going on than just plain randomness. And even in the simple models we've looked at, quite often the theoretical distribution is not very easy to derive for the summary statistics. And the complications arises. So for example, if you want to look at small subgraph counts, then so if you want to see which subgraph counts are significant, then we have a joint testing issue. And but we have dependence between our motifs or small subgraphs. So for example, in this stochastic model, if I wanted to count the number of triangles and the number of cycles of length 4 jointly, then I would run into dependence issues, because you've got this cycle of length 4, it also gives rise to 3 triangles. So there's triangles and cycles of length 4 may not be independent. Actually, here it was 2 triangles. We've got 1, 2, 3. This is the cycle of length 4. This is the 1 triangle. And the other one is the second triangle. So you have to be careful when you look at your summary statistics. Okay, so if you can't determine the asymptotic distribution analytically, then there is Monte Carlo test. And that's sort of the upbeat message about statistics on networks. Because Monte Carlo tests are exact tests. And in principle, you can always use them. They might also not be easy to implement, but they might be the easier of many options. So the general framework is, suppose you've got a test statistic T0. And suppose that you are able to simulate a random sample from this distribution, which is the random sample T01, T02, and so on, which is determined by the null hypothesis. If this null hypothesis is continuous, which might not quite be the case, but for just for illustration, let's assume here that it's continuous, and assume that we reject the null hypothesis for large values of T0, then if you want to reject at a level alpha, which is m over n plus 1, where n is the number of observations, then what we can do is we observe the actual value T star, calculate from the data, and then we simulate a random sample of size n from the distribution under the null hypothesis. We rank all the data together, and then we see where T star is in this set ranked in decreasing order. So if T star is the top observation all the time, and we reject when we see a large value of T star, then we would reject the hypothesis many times. If you so here's going to do a simple example. Just to say this is exact. It's not an approximate test, it's an exact test. It might not be very powerful. So if you have 99, if you simulate 99 observations, the lowest p-value you can see is 0.01. The smaller alpha, the more simulations you need. In discrete data, you usually see ties, and network data are usually discrete, but we can just break the ties randomly. So then that still works. We don't exactly get confidence intervals using this, but we can use a similar procedure for Monte Carlo. Let me just skip to this slide before I do the next slide. So this is an example for subgraph counts. Suppose we think, so often people think subgraph counts can be modeled by this polyaptly distribution with two parameters, lambda and a. So suppose that we think we have observations from a polyaptly distribution with known parameter lambda, and we want to test whether a is equal to a half, and the alternative is that a is larger than a half. Then we observe we observe a value of 24 for a count of motif in a real network, and we think that we reject the null hypothesis. Well, in this case, we will reject if the motif counts are higher, because the larger a, the larger the motif counts. So because the slide is also finite, I generated only 49 IID samples from the null distribution, polyaptly 0.5 and 10. And here they are. And you see the value of 24 is here very far to the right. So if it really was from a polyaptly distribution, then only in 4%, so the probability of seeing a value this high or higher would be only 4%, 0.04. So we would reject the null hypothesis at the 5% level. So this is just to make the method a little bit clearer. For Monte Carlo test, in random graphs, you often just shuffle edges. So the configuration model is such that you would move an edge, delete an edge, and resample an edge, and that would make you shuffle around in the network space. So thinking that we create all these tests uniform from networks, which are uniformly created uniformly from the set of all these networks with the same node degree sequence, are called conditional uniform graph tests. But there can be a problem in that you might not quite know what you're testing against. So in Bernoulli random graphs, in a dense regime, it turns out that the number of edges and the number of true stars and the number of triangles are asymptotically perfectly correlated. So that means if I give you the number of edges, you can give me the number of true stars and the number of triangles. And indeed, the asymptotic clustering coefficient is the expected clustering coefficient. So we can carry out the Monte Carlo test, but we have to know what we test against. So here, if we shuffle the edges at random, we wouldn't actually see anything else than in terms of number of triangles than we've seen already. Yeah. So that mustn't be a surprise. So we still have to check what we're actually doing. And also, drawing uniformly at random when you've got a complex network model might not be so easy. Often you've got an algorithm, but the algorithm might not cover the complete data set. So that's almost, well, the end of this lecture. Time's almost up. There are many further topics in this area, of course. It's just an introduction. One is validating edges. So how do you find out whether an edge which you see in the data should be there, or whether it's an error, or whether an edge which you don't see should be there, and so it has been omitted. How do you predict functions from the network? So once you've got a network, how do you predict what the network does? How do you use networks to identify important, say, proteins or residues for interventions, biological networks, or generally, how do you identify important nodes? How do you detect communities and networks? So your social network, your network of friends will be consistent of different communities, maybe some from your family, some from your school, some from your sports club. How do you identify the communities in this network? Also, networks might have a hierarchical structure, such as food webs. So, who eats whom? Combining networks from different data sources is also a big problem, something where computational power is needed. And the last slide, something to watch out for. When you see a network, quite often it's only a sample from a larger network. When you draw a sample from a network, the samples might not follow the same mechanism. So in particular, samples of scale-free networks are not scale-free. That's been shown. And samples from an exponential random graph model are not generally exponential random graphs. Samples from a stochastic block model are not generally a stochastic block model. So there's a whole issue about sampling, which is a big area of research at the moment. That might actually link in with Ben might be talking about.
I'm not going to talk about networks.
No, but the sampling issue is more generally. So sampling is actually really quite interesting area. Thank you for your attention. That's it.